Hi, I'm Tony Rossi for The Christophers, and today Paula Faris from ABC News will discuss Season 3 of her podcast, Journeys of Faith, which focuses on the often contentious topics of politics and religion, and she's also going to talk about her new memoir, Called Out, Why I Traded 2 Dream Jobs for a Life of True Calling. Stay with us. Christopher Closeup starts right now. Hello and welcome to Christopher Closeup. I'm Tony Rossi, and you may remember that ABC News' Paula Faris was on this show a little over a year ago. Paula talked about how a season of hell that included a miscarriage, a concussion, and a head-on car accident led her to reconfigure her life. She had prioritized work over family for too long, and she realized that God was telling her to step back and slow down. Paula has now written a memoir about that period in her life, and it's titled Called Out, Why I Traded 2 Dream Jobs for a Life of True Calling. Joining me today to talk about the book, as well as Season 3 of her podcast, Journeys of Faith, I am pleased to welcome back to Christopher Closeup, Paula Faris. Paula, it's so great to have you back on the show again.
It is great to be back. And where have you been hiding this water all my life?
We have been dealing, Paula, when she got here, tried this what is it, strawberry-infused water we have at the studio here.
Strawberry and mint-infused water.
Strawberry and mint-infused water.
I'm on my 3rd glass.
so she
Delicious.
She is well ready to talk for a good solid half hour now with all that water.
Probably going to have to take a break because I drank so much water. That's where we're heading.
Okay. Well, now for people who may not remember, you were on the show last year. You were talking about your new podcast, Journeys of Faith, which has just started Season 3. So in case people missed it last time, tell us a little bit about the philosophy behind Journeys of Faith and why in Season 3 you have chosen to focus on 2 of the most contentious topics in our world today, politics and religion.
Yes, right. A little pivot for Season 3. Well, the whole genesis of the podcast was to give newsmakers and influencers an opportunity to talk about their faith in a mainstream outlet. They don't have the opportunity to do that now. And when you talk to them about their faith, you can really open up so many doors and see these newsmakers and influencers in a different light, because traditionally or typically their faith has really guided so many of those substantive decisions that they've made along the way. It guides who they are. It's their guiding light, their guiding principle. Season 3, we wanted to pivot into the murky waters of politics and faith. You see the intersectionality of politics and faith, because we're in a political season, we're in an election year, but we wanted to look at politics in a different light and look at these politicians in a different light. They're out there giving their stump speeches and, their reused sound bites. And we wanted to peel back the layers and give them an opportunity to talk about their faith. And so we're talking to Republicans, we're talking to Democrats about faith and how it influences who they are, but how it influences their policies. Right. So many of them, they have so many stark policies in contrast to one another. So how does their faith guide those policies and their decisions? And it's just been a wonderful opportunity to see them in a different light. Yeah,
well, I was going to say just about that, because I listened to all the Season 3 interviews, and when you're talking to politicians, they do have the inclination to do the stump speech sound bites.
The same thing.
But you do a great job of kind of drawing out the real persona, the person behind the persona. Do you think just the nature of the podcast allows for that more than a standard news interview, just the setting and the way you make them comfortable?
Absolutely. Because when you're in a traditional, when I'm conducting an interview, whether it's live or whether it's on tape, you're not typically using the whole thing. Okay. So I may conduct an interview, like I did an interview about a month ago with Pat Sajak, and on tape, it's like 35 minutes long, right? But when we cut it down for TV purposes, it's 6 minutes long. So you're losing so much of it. So this is an opportunity to just have a nice, organic conversation. And when you're allowing them to open up, when you're giving them more time, they just naturally start opening up. So I think it's a combination of the topic which is something they don't really get to talk about a lot, but also the platform, which is the podcast.
I'm Tony Rossi. You're listening to Christopher Closeup. I'm with Paula Faris from ABC News talking about her Journeys of Faith podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Echo, and probably an ABC Radio and a few other places. One of the other strengths of the podcast is, like you said, you interview Republicans and Democrats. And I remember, last time you were on, you said when you were on The View, you were struggling with, they wanted you to say your point of view, but as a journalist, you tried to be more even-handed. And what I found about these interviews is that you are very even-handed with the interview subjects. With Republicans and Democrats, you talked to Ted Cruz about his support of gun rights and his stance on undocumented immigrants. With Tom Steyer, you questioned his abortion rights stance and pointed out that people see the unborn child as society's most vulnerable. That even-handedness, is that difficult to strive for, you think, in today's media environment? Or is it just that's just kind of the platform of how you approach journalism?
I think that's just I think that's what a journalist, that's the definition of a journalist, right?
Yeah.
Is to be objective, to be neutral. I don't want somebody to look at me and say, oh, she's Republican or she's Democrat. I think the challenge right now in this climate that we're in is we have pundits, we have commentary, we have journalists, and they're kind of all in the same pool.
Sure.
And you've seen it probably more so over the last 3 years where journalists have they haven't necessarily stuck to their true stripes of just being an objective storyteller. And that's unfortunate. But there are still a lot of really good ones out there, but it's confusing for the general public because they see someone delivering commentary and they see a pundit and then they see a journalist and it's hard for them to distinguish. But I think the onus is on us more now as journalists than ever. And I think because there's so much chaos and confusion and because they need to know what is fact and what is fiction, I know I feel like I have a great responsibility to be more objective now than I ever have been.
Sure.
So, because I think it's really important. I don't want to be the story. I want to be able to tell their story. And so I think it's a cognizant decision. Before I'm asking a question, any question that I'm asking, I just want to make sure, is this what people want to know? But also, am I asking this in a very neutral manner? Yeah. And I also believe you can ask any question. It's just a matter of how you ask it. If you can ask it in a respectful tone. Again, I don't want to be the story. There are some out there that want to be the story. More power to them. You have your YouTube channel, whatever you want. But I've always been a narrator, a storyteller, and I want to be able to tell your story, but it's not about me.
Yeah, well, you've done that successfully with the
Thank
podcast.
You.
So,
Thank you.
The other thing I found about listening to it, and I would say especially in the interviews with Tulsi Gabbard and Nikki Haley, is I found it very educational about world religions. I've been exposed to plenty of Christianity, but one is a Hindu, the other one started off as a Sikh. Nikki Haley was a Sikh, and I've just found I found those interviews especially educational about world religions. Have you learned something about world religions as you've been working on the show?
I have learned. So I went to a small Christian college and I have a Bible minor, and I feel like I know quite a bit about world religion. But when I embarked on this podcast, I realized how much I didn't know and how ignorant I was about so many different religions. And I think, Tony, if you and if Americans would just take the time to show up as our true selves, whether you're Jewish or I'm Sikh or you're Christian or Buddhist or Muslim, and we show up as our true selves to work and we show up as our true selves in our circles and we start having these really great provocative conversations about what's important to your culture and tradition and your religion, I think we can really start to break down so many of these barriers of naivete and ignorance that are really consuming our society right now. I've learned a ton about other religions, and that's what's been the most fascinating aspect for me. And I've also found, and it may be, counterintuitive, but or surprising in the sense that in learning of other faiths, it's caused me to dig deeper into my own faith. And I think no matter what faith you are, you need to know what you believe and why you believe it. Yeah. You should be able to dig into it and ask questions. Don't just believe it because that's how you were raised and your parents taught you, but really question, why do I believe this? What do I believe? And it's for if anything, I feel like my faith has only grown and deepened since I embarked on this journey.
Yeah,
of faith.
That is. Speaking of journeys of faith, that is the title of Paula Faris's podcast. She is from ABC News. You'll know her from Good Morning America. She's the former co-anchor of GMA Weekend, former co-host of The View.
Formers. Right?
She is the current senior national correspondent for ABC News, and we'll get to why she's some of those formers in a little while. But we're talking about God, and it's such an important part of people's lives. And yet, I remember last time you mentioned that when a person does a straight news interview, say for ABC News or for other news organizations, if they mention God or Jesus or Allah, sometimes that comment winds up on the cutting room floor. Mm-hmm. If God is so important to so many people, why are mentions of him, do you think, cut out sometimes? Well,
I think because it makes people uncomfortable.
Okay.
And when I was talking to Cory Booker, Senator Cory Booker, for the podcast, he said that some people are afraid to talk about it, especially Democrats. They don't talk about God a lot because they're scared of being perceived. They want to be perceived as this big tent and inclusive party, okay? And they're scared that they may not be perceived as that. So I think, you want to be in news, you want to be as neutral as possible. You don't want to offend anybody. But I also think, we do need to realize that this was a country that was based on, faith in foundational principles, and it is very important to people. And I think we're getting back to that point where we are encouraging people to talk openly about their faith, because you see the good that it will do in our society in terms of breaking down some of those barriers of like I said, ignorance and naivete.
Yeah. And I don't think if someone mentions Jesus, it shouldn't really offend anyone. I'm not offended if someone mentions Buddha.
Yes.
So, it shouldn't really offend anyone.
Again, some are afraid that they won't be seen as inclusive.
Sure.
But I think, tolerance and inclusivity means that you accept me and I accept you. And we're not trying to change one another. We can respect one another. We can respect our differences, but we can still show up as our true self.
Sure. Well, one of the things I have long admired about you, having watched you on GMA Weekend, is that, you're vocally a Christian. Your co-host on the show, Dan Harris, sorry. Dan Harris is kind of agnostic-ish.
He's an agnostic Buddhist. That's how he likes to describe himself.
And he's like, you've called him like a brother to you.
He's one of my dearest friends.
Have you always had an easy time of befriending people, even if you don't necessarily think alike? Because, again, that seems to be a challenge for people nowadays. Like, we all have to have the same views about everything to be friends. Have you always been that kind of big tent person?
I think I always have. I remember, being young, I was that type of person that wanted to sit next to the kid that didn't have a friend, because I had felt that growing up as well, where I was, bullied and made fun of. But, my parents always just encouraged me to be kind to people and to love people. And I think I've just inherently been a compassionate person, but I also like to challenge the status quo, and I like to hang out with people that challenge me.
Okay.
And so that's been one of the dynamics of the relationship that I have with Dan Harris. I call myself the younger sister he never had nor wanted. And we have a beautiful relationship. It's one filled with a lot of respectful debate and conversation. But again, I think you need that in your life. You don't want to surround yourself with an echo chamber and like-minded people. You want people to challenge you to be the best version of yourself. And for me, that's always been my approach.
Sure, the whole iron sharpens iron thing.
It does sharpen iron.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Tony Rossi, and you're listening to Christopher Closeup. I'll be back in a minute with more of my conversation with Paula Faris. But first, here's a message the Christophers would like to share with you.
Loneliness is a painful emotion, felt by everyone at some point in their lives. That's because God created us to be in relationship with one another, both spiritually and physically. Community is as necessary for a human being as air and water. That's why the Christophers have prepared a news note called Finding Christ in Community. It includes insights on moving past loneliness and stories about people whose lives have been enriched by reaching out to or accepting help from others. To request your free copy of Finding Christ in Community, send an email to radio@christophers.org or call our toll-free number at 1-888-298-4050. We look forward to hearing from you.
Welcome back to Christopher Closeup. I'm Tony Rossi, talking today with ABC News senior national correspondent Paula Faris. One of our topics has been her podcast, Journeys of Faith, on which she interviews newsmakers about their spiritual lives. Season 3 of the podcast has focused on politics and faith. She talks to major national politicians such as Senator Ted Cruz, presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, Tulsi Gabbard, Nikki Haley, and many more people about how their faith influences their policies. Paula has also written a great memoir titled Called Out, Why I Traded 2 Dream Jobs for a Life of True Calling. But it's more than a memoir about her own life. It offers plenty of advice for any listener, no matter what phase of life you're in, to look at your life and find what God is calling you to do and how to distinguish a faith calling from a vocational calling. Now, here is more of my interview with ABC News' Paula Faris. In addition to this being your story, this book also takes a broader scope in that it could apply to the lives of any of our listeners right now, not just to successful broadcast journalists. Tell us a bit about Called Out.
So the book is essentially why I walked away from Good Morning America Weekend, why I walked away from The View, my 2 dream jobs at the height of my career, and what I discovered about myself in that space, that I realized I didn't know who I was outside of what I did. I had really linked my entire identity to my job. And so when I took that step to walk away, I was lost for a long time, Tony, just to be honest. And I had thought that I had, because I'm a woman of faith, I had rooted myself in my faith. And I thought my job doesn't define me. But the moment that I walked away from it, it had, and that was a scary point for me. But the whole reason that I pumped the brakes was I was burnt out. And I think this, regardless of your faith background, and this book is written, it's a book about purpose and identity and calling. It's through a faith lens, but it's about who we are outside of what we do. And it's about buying this lie from society that our only worth is our work and that our value is our vocation, that our calling is our career. I mean, we're taught from a young age, what do you want to do when you grow up? One of the first questions you ask somebody, what do you do for a living? And even subconsciously, we're projecting this narrative that you're only as good as your job. You're only as good as what you do. And I leaned into all of that because I thought that was my calling, right? And I burned out. And I really felt that I was supposed to slow down. I was losing sight of what was really important to me, my friends, my family, my relationship with my husband and my kids and my church. And I had sensed that God wanted me to slow down, but I'm like, hey, you called me here, God. Like, I'm at the height of my career. Why would I pump the brakes now? Do you think I'm crazy? And I went through a season, whether or not you believe God allows things to happen, I believe God allowed me to go through a really rough patch where he tried to get my attention and get me to slow down. And within 7 months, I had a miscarriage with an emergency surgery. I had a concussion at work. Someone, while I was on a live shot, threw an object at my head 60 miles an hour. And I was out of work for 3 weeks. The day I get cleared to go back to work, I get into a head-on car crash that leads, then I develop influenza, and then that turns into pneumonia. I was like, okay, God, I'll slow down. You know, I didn't want to. I was so addicted to my job, and I was so addicted to the high of achievement and accomplishment and accolade. And I was addicted to this calling. And but I went through that and I said, okay, God, I'll pump the brakes. But it was really my fear that didn't allow me to pump the brakes for so long. But then I went through that patch and God got my attention.
God got your attention. Would you say, in biblical terms, had you made a false idol of career, you think?
I definitely, absolutely, unequivocally. When I went into broadcasting, clear eyes, full heart, can't lose. I had pure intentions, but then I just got caught up in it. And I think that's natural for so many of us. And even if that's not our intention to begin with, again, it's what society tells us. What do you do for a living? What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? Your worth is your job, careers. And we almost always define success with career, do we not? So even if that's not where your heart is, that's where society is. And it's hard to be unaffected by that.
Sure. I'm talking to Paula Faris. Her book is called Called Out, Why I Traded 2 Dream Jobs for a Life of True Calling. You mentioned the idea of calling before, and that's one of the themes of the book, that there are these different types of calling in our lives. There's vocational calling, there's faith calling. Tell us about the difference and how you came to see the difference between the two.
Yeah, and it's so... What frustrates me so much is I go to church regularly, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard, even from the pulpit, you've got to find your calling in this world. And I remember one pastor saying, you don't have to find your calling will find you. And I feel like it's one of those buzzwords of our generation. But if I really asked you to define it, how I don't know how you would define it, but most people would define calling synonymous with their career.
Yeah.
And I bought into that. But in this space, I really learned that we have 2 callings on our life. We have a faith calling, which I refer to it as your faith calling or your purpose in the book. And we have a vocational calling. So your faith calling, your purpose is never going to change. Your vocational calling will change throughout your life. Your faith calling, your purpose, mine is singular, to love God and love people. That's it. Never going to change. And that is my purpose on this earth and in this world, is to love God and love people. My vocational calling is going to change, but my vocation is just the vehicle.
Right.
It's just the conduit by which I'll fulfill my purpose to love God and love people. And when I really understood that for honestly the very first time, it was a paradigm shift, but it changed everything for me. What I do doesn't define me. What I do isn't who I am. Who I am is I'm here to love God and love people. End of story. Done. No more than that.
Yeah.
And when we are so tied to what we do, we are so tied to our vocation, the moment that it shifts, Tony, we are bound to have an identity crisis. I had one.
Yeah.
I had a full-blown identity crisis. I didn't know who I was outside of it. And just understanding that vocation is just the vehicle, vocation will change, giving yourself the permission to allow your vocation to change, giving yourself the permission to branch out, giving yourself the permission to off-ramp. Don't buy those lies from society that you can't off-ramp, that you can't branch out. And don't buy the lie that your identity is in what you do.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a huge paradigm shift, but I felt like it was this huge aha moment that I had been missing my whole life. And so now when I think of calling, I'm like, well, which calling are we talking about? Because vocational calling is going to change.
Yeah.
Faith calling never does.
Yeah, exactly. And just on the topic of vocation, because I reread this part of your book before coming to the studio today, you do point out that vocation isn't just...
Thank you for reading, by the way. Most of them like skim chapter 1. Here's a good little buzz quote that I can ask her about. But thank you for reading it.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating book. And you point out in the book that vocation isn't just, a job in the outside world. It also applies to stay-at-home moms. Because sometimes career women and stay-at-home moms, there seems to be this thing between the two. And just talk to that a little. Yeah.
No, and I think vocation can be seasonal. Like, you see the statistics where career women are, I think 40% of career women are off-ramping to stay at home. Well, that's the other thing. Vocation is seasonal. So I can take a season and I can raise my kids. That is a full-blown vocation. Your vocation as a stay-at-home mom is that it's your vehicle to love your children. Okay. So no matter if you go back to work as a lawyer, well, that's your vehicle to love people, to love God and love people. Same thing with stay-at-home moms. Yeah. This is just your vehicle by which you're loving your children and you're loving God and you're loving people through it.
Yeah.
And I think it is the hardest vocation in the world. And yes, I am a mother. I have the utmost of respect for women. And can I just say, hate the term stay at home, because there's no staying at home. Most moms that are home with their children and have either paused their career or they've decided not to go that route, there's no staying. They're running. We should say running around moms. I don't know another way to put it, but there's no staying at home. And, I think, unfortunately, society, again, it's not enough, though, for them to be stay-at-home moms. But what do you do? Or what did you do before you did this? As if they need some sort of validation, which is just a lie.
Yeah. No, it's staying at home and being a mom or running around and being a mom is a tough job.
It's the greatest vocation that you can be called to.
Yeah.
But again, I think you are vocationally called into certain capacities.
Sure. I'm talking to Paula Faris. Her book is Called Out, Why I Traded 2 Dream Jobs for a Life of True Calling. You also, as a Christian, you also put a lot of Bible stories in the book. You read these stories in the Bible, these characters like David, and you apply them to modern life. Could you just talk about that aspect of the book a little?
Well, I didn't want the book to be straight memoir because I don't think people honestly care about my life all that much. And so I wanted it to be I wanted it to be a reporter's notebook, so to speak.
Okay.
I wanted it to be part my story, anecdotes, biblical anecdotes, historical anecdotes, and then also other interviews that I've conducted because I want people to see themselves in this story. And I really do feel the more I talk about it with people, there's so many people struggling with these tenets of what am I here for? What am I called to do? You know, what am I uniquely equipped to do? But it was important for me to weave in a lot of those biblical anecdotes because just to see them, it's so often you can read the same thing over and over, but for me, these anecdotes and these biblical stories, I saw them in a different way. It was like I put a different lens on almost once I started seeing things for the first time, and seeing vocational calling for what it is and seeing my faith calling for what it is. But as a woman of faith, I wanted people to see these stories in a different light, and to see how they can relate to them.
And you do a good job of that too.
Thank you.
I'm Tony Rossi. You're listening to Christopher Closeup, and I have been talking with ABC News senior national correspondent Paula Faris. We are out of time, but we're going to keep talking and bring you more of our interview on our next show. In the meantime, you can catch Paula's podcast, Journeys of Faith, on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Echo, and ABC News Radio. And remember also, Paula's memoir is titled Called Out, Why I Traded 2 Dream Jobs for a Life of True Calling. Now, before we end today's show, here's another message the Christophers would like to share with you.
God is calling each of us to find our mission in life right now. It might involve a radical change, or it may be a call to serve those around us in a deeper way. To help you along that path, the Christophers have prepared a news note called Discover Your Mission in Life. It offers insights about discerning the path that God is calling you towards and shares stories about those who have embraced their particular mission. To request your free copy of Discover Your Mission in Life, send an email to radio@christophers.org or call our toll-free number at 1-888-298-4050. That's 1-888-298-4050. We look forward to hearing from you.
In closing, I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in today, and I encourage you to visit our website at christophers.org to learn more about the Christophers and to download free literature and podcasts. When you're there, you can also find links to our blog and our Facebook and Twitter pages. And if you have any questions or comments about the show, you can send an email to radio@christophers.org. Our engineer for today's show is Brian Bonifacio, and I'm Tony Rossi, your host. Thanks again for joining us, and remember that it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness.